Before, I'm just going to ask Nick some questions today, but before I do, extend a welcome to Nick and to Sarah too. I'm absolutely delighted to have them in Australia on something of a Dunera tour. I've had contact with Nick and Sarah for several years now, and it's always been remarkably warm and cordial. Nick always replies, and it's really sort of a rather lovely thing. Sometimes you can be a little nervous writing to people with high public profile, and Nick's always been charming and helpful, as has Sarah, and it's really lovely to have them in Australia in person talking to us about Dunera.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start off with a question, my questions. So your father, Nick, Hans, Karl Rosenblut, was born in Berlin on 4th of June 1915. Can you tell us about his early life and the events that took him from Berlin to Britain and the Dunera?
Yeah, to know about my father's background, we really need to know about his parents' background, because his father was one of the early Zionist leaders. When he was young, he was hugely affected by the anti-Semitism of the late part of the 19th century, and was therefore so committed to the cause, as was his brother Martin, that virtually my father was brought up in a Zionist household, and yet his mother, my grandmother, was not particularly Zionist. Actually, it's quite an interesting story, because the two brothers, Felix and Martin, my grandmother Annie was at first going to marry Martin. And then she changed her mind and went for Felix after she'd been engaged to Martin. My grandfather's background, he was brought up in a town called Eberswalde, which is now part of Eastern Germany. It used to be literally East Germany. As I say, he was very affected by the Dreyfus affair in Paris, in France. And he wanted to become a lawyer. He wanted to do something about that, and he wanted to become a Zionist because he feared that anti-Semitism was on the rise. But because of this tension in the household, my grandmother never wanted to go to Israel, or Palestine. She thought, she was living a nice middle-class life in Berlin. My grandfather was posted to London. He was a Zionist representative in London. He had no... There was just a genuine tension, quite clearly. Eventually, my grandfather, when he finally decided to go to live in Palestine, and my grandmother decided not to go. So there was a big schism in the family. And so my father was brought up partly in London, because that's where my grandfather had been posted, then back in Berlin. And then the very moment that Hitler was made Chancellor, the story goes that my grandmother was one of the very few critics of Hitler who'd actually bothered to read Mein Kampf. And the day that Hitler was appointed Chancellor, she sent my father to the railway station to buy tickets for London. And they left within certainly a month, possibly a week.
It's remarkably prescient.
Yeah, she was a brave woman. And she was obviously bringing my father and her daughter Dina up on her own at that stage. But she was clearly a very forceful woman. And what she wanted to do is get out, and she did. And none of her side of the family finished up in the Holocaust.
It's quite remarkable to Lee. I mean, it feels almost dopey saying this in a room that doesn't need this to be said, but the sadness involved in people who thought this would pass, or that surely Hitler wouldn't be that bad, and so few people left in 1933. It's almost unusual, that story.
It is, but even if you read the German press right up to 1938, the standard German press was saying things like, we know Hitler talks loudly and threatens, and we know he's got the black shirts, but we are a civilized people. This is not a Jewish newspaper. This is the main German newspapers. These terrible things that people are talking about will surely never come to pass. There was this sense that this couldn't possibly happen in such a civilized nation. So yeah, she was present, she was unusual. And, we've existed because of her prescience.
Can you mentioned your grandfather there, Pinchas Rosen, who became Israel's first Minister for Justice, as Merav said. Can you tell us more about, I'm going to jump forward a little bit, about his career and life in Israel? Yeah,
he founded what we now consider the Liberal Party in Israel. He, as a lawyer, represented German Jews who were trying to emigrate and got a following in particular among Germans who were new to Israel. Formed a political party. I mean, he'd be rolling in his grave if he saw what the politics of Israel are now, because he was, if you think of the Stern Gang and the, now represented by the Netanyahu lot, he would have been at the other end of the extreme. He wasn't a socialist, he wasn't a communist at all, very much liberal, but he wanted an accord with the Arabs. And so, although he was very close to Ben Gurion, there was a tension between them, particularly when it came up to the Declaration of Independence, because my grandfather was insisting that they keep trying to get agreement with the Arabs. And there was apparently something, not a breakdown, but there was others were getting so frustrated with him because he wouldn't sign. And I think he was the last person to sign the Declaration of Independence, or last person to agree to sign it. But he did. He then became Minister of Justice, not because his party had much power, actually. I think it was, several books have talked about, he was regarded as a man of great probity. And Ben Gurion and his colleagues wanted someone as Israel's foundation, who clearly would not be swayed by good or ill, which came to serve him ill later on. I'm happy to talk about that. He also commissioned and partly wrote the Constitution, Israeli Constitution. So, and he was, I think it served 7 or 8 times as Justice Minister in the early years. So he had quite an impact. I might as well tell you the story now. Then what happened was the Levon affair. I don't know if any of you know about the Levon affair, but it had this sort of, for my grandfather, an echo of the Dreyfus affair in France. An officer had been, he thought, probably wrongly accused of causing a dreadful military cock-up in Egypt. The Prime Minister wanted it hushed down. And my grandfather was the Minister of Justice, so you can't hush something down. And they had an argument over it, and there was a commission of inquiry, and it cleared the man. And I don't know if it's true, but I read somewhere that Ben Gurion and my grandfather never spoke again after that.
As an aside, did your grandfather ever write a memoir or an account of his life?
No, there's a biography of him, an official biography, but it's in Hebrew, and I don't speak a word of Hebrew, I'm afraid, so I can't tell you much about it.
So also on the dinero was your father's cousin Eli Rosenblut, who was born in Copenhagen on 20th of November 1919, so about 4 years younger than your father. I understand that he and your father were very close. Can you tell us about their friendship?
Well, I can't tell you much about it because I don't know much except what I've subsequently read. Firstly, I called him Eli as well. Apparently it was pronounced Eli. And I know that they were very close. I mean, one of the reasons I know they were very close is when I was about 15 or 16, my father asked to talk to me about something, and he said, whatever you do, if you smoke, drink, he didn't mention drugs because when I was 15 or 16 they weren't a big part of society, I'm that old, but he said, whatever you do, please don't ride a motorbike. I want you to promise me that you will never ride a motorbike. So I said, okay. But I subsequently discovered that Eli, like my father, had got back to England from the whole dinero escapade, had joined the army, like my father, had survived the war, like my father, until a few weeks before the end of the war, when he was in Italy with the forces, and he died in a motorcycle crash. And for the rest of my life, when I was a child, there was a woman called Deborah. I couldn't quite work out what relation she was. And a cousin called Anthony, who I was very close to, never could quite work out what the relationship was. And actually Deborah was the English wife of Ailey. And she'd become pregnant while Ailey was off in Italy, so Ailey never met his son. And they were close friends of ours, and I could never quite work that relationship out until much, much later.
I think clearly from your answer, I mean, I'll come back to Dunera in a second, but Dunera generally was not something your father spoke of to you?
I knew nothing about the Dunera. Nothing. And it's only when I started researching it that I suddenly understood, really understood, why so many Holocaust survivors never spoke about their experience. It's partly because we, the next generation, we're busy living our own lives. We don't ask about our parents. My children have never asked about my parents. I've had at the British television licence payers' expense. I've had the most remarkable life, seeing the most extraordinary places and talking to the most extraordinary people. My children never asked me. So it's partly that. But it's the shame. It's the shame of being a prisoner. And my father's letters, and I've got something, we mentioned this a little earlier. You don't know what this is. And I didn't know what this is until literally a few weeks ago. After my father died, we found a whole lot of papers, which my sister put in a great big bag, and we went through them, didn't know what to do with them. And eventually, last year, we thought, well, there are obviously huge bundles of things about Dunera. And I spoke to someone at the Imperial War Museum. They now call them IWM. They don't like the word Imperial anymore. And they almost bit my arm off. Can we have these things? And there were some wonderful pictures and fantastic documentation in there, a huge pile of stuff. So we gave it all to the IWM. Just before we were heading, well, not just before, 2 weeks before heading off here, I was clearing out some old files, some completely different files that were in a different filing cabinet altogether, and came across a whole new stack of papers. And here they are. My father was the hut captain, I think, of Hut 26 at Hay. And so he's got the records from that, but he was also in charge of the post office. So in effect, he was the secretary for the camp. So in here, apart from all the stuff I've given to the Imperial War Museum, is an extraordinary trove of documentation, record after record of who said what and so forth. But there's also some wonderful things I'd like to show you. And I'm going to give these to you. I'm going to give these to you on the basis you promised they will go to the museum where somebody can get access, other academics can get access to them.
Absolutely, honoured and delighted.
So here, paper was short there, so a diary was a third of a notebook which had been cut this way and this way. There's only a little part of it. This is my father's diary that he kept from the first day of arriving. There's stuff about what happened on the Dunera, but it also talks about the shame of, and as they were driven through Australia, even after the appalling things that had happened on the Dunera, the shame of being prisoners, the shame of people going thumbs down, because they all thought they were Italian or German prisoners of war. But there's some wonderful things too about how wonderful then the Australians were when they actually finished up at Hay. It's after the horrors and deprivation on the Dunera. First it was the food, but how wonderful the officers, and right down, he says, to the most junior soldier, how honourable and decent they were. So there's some marvellous stuff in there. There's some also, although I'm afraid most of the art has gone to the Imperial War Museum. Here's a classic from his cousin Ailey. Ailey was a tremendous graphic designer, graphic artist, and did many things. So all of these, when you open them up, this is the quarters, and they open up, and you can open up the roof, and then you can open up and see. I'm going to be very careful with it because obviously this is an original. There's another one with more of the hut here. I'm afraid the IWM has got more of these that open up more. But this was on my father's birthday there. Ailey and others did a whole lot of stuff for him, and they're absolutely wonderful. I just, forgive me, want to show you some other things. I said that paper was in short supply. Here's one of the notices, which says, Monday, 10th of February, general hut cleaning, okay? But it's written over the previous notice to everybody because it was difficult to get paper, and you'll see that from the letters. They're very, very closely written for obvious reasons. This is something they showed out of the window of one of the buses as they were being taken. Oh, sorry, no, it's not. That's the wrong one. We do not want to write on notepaper printed for Nazis and fascists. Again, in some of the other documentation that the IWM have, there were things that they held on the windows of the buses saying, we are not Nazis, we are anti-Nazis. Or we are not Nazis, we are victims of the Nazis. Then this was held up to people in the camp. As you can see, I don't know if you can read that, anybody. It's a powerful interests are at work on your behalf. Lieutenant Colonel Flynn. That was the first inkling they had. My father knew from letters he was getting from his girlfriend, my mother, Joy, that things were happening, but this is the first official notification that in England people were beginning to realise things had gone completely haywire.
Just to add a little context there, Lieutenant Colonel Thane was the commandant at Hay. He's a very good man, and it was under his command within weeks that he allowed kosher butcher to be set up at Hay. Which is quite an extraordinary development, we think, in a time of war, that a man would have such humanity to make that happen.
Here's a letter home just saying you cannot judge what it is to be interned, both physically and mentally, and everyone outside fighting a war which is more my fight than it is theirs against Hitler. So I just, having seen all this stuff, it just wasn't so surprising at all that he never spoke to us about it. It was just shame. And for me, an astonishing revelation, all the stuff that's now emerged.
It's quite remarkable. I didn't know that was going to happen, and what a privilege for that to... Thank you, Nick, for sharing that with us.
Well, you were nice about me. Can I say, Seamus has been so supportive all the time that we got involved in this. And thank you, Seamus.
Thank you. I was going to ask Nick to tell us about details of his father's life at Hay, but I might rephrase that question given what he's already said. So... your father was arrested in London on 27th of June 1940 at the same time as Ailey.
Yeah.
And together, as Nick mentioned, they lived in Hut 26, Camp 7 at Hay. And Hut 26 is probably the most famous of all the Dunera huts for the collection of men that was in that hut, including Erwin Fabian, who died in 2020, aged 104. Many of you would know him as an internationally recognised sculptor. If you Google his work after this meeting, you'll get many results. And another artist who was in that hut was a man called Georg Teltscher, who had studied at the Bauhaus and was a wonderful graphic designer. And I am sort of giving this context, Nick, in the hope that you'll explain and sort of have a lead in there that beautiful pop-up hut that Ailey designed. I know of only 3 in the world. One is now in Sydney, which was donated by the widow of Georg Teltscher to Sydney. And Teltscher obviously had his given to him, must have had his given to him by Ailey. But can you say something about that? It's remarkable, that hut.
Well, all I know is what we found in these. I mean, I wish I could tell you I was a great historian and read everything beforehand, but it was actually stumbling across this stuff. What I do know is that on my father's birthday, there were so many. It was a wonderful little treasure trove of things, and there were poems to him. There was one written by all the other people in Hut 26, and it's. It's quite emotional just thinking about it. It finished up about, let's look on the bright side of things, and may your life finish up with joy, which was his fiancée's name. And among the letters, it's quite clear that those who were married and those who had girlfriends in England were finding it pretty tough. But it's beautiful, the comradeship that came absolutely flows out of that. This was a really bonding experience for the people who were there.
I think that's absolutely right. And these, one of the beautiful things, Nick described the graphic design and the skills of Ailey, but this hut, I think you can see a video of it on the State Library of New South Wales website of it being opened. And I, as someone with no creativity, have no idea how he managed this, but this hut becomes three-dimensional and pops up, and you can open the roof and you can open and see, and it's all just done on simple, plain wartime paper, and it's quite remarkable. If you can find the video on the State Library of New South Wales website, I very much encourage you to look at it. Hans's and Ailey's internment experiences were essentially identical. They left Hay on the same date. They went to Tatura and then left Tatura on the same date, and then they left Australia on the same date. So on 15th of October 1941, which is relatively early in terms of the Dunera story, they sailed for Britain on a ship called the Ceramic.
Incidentally, I know that because in here are the lunch and dinner menus on the Ceramic. And when you think what they went through on the Dunera on the outbound, and then coming back, they're offered a dinner menu with all these wonderful things in the middle of wartime. The contrast must have been astonishing.
And in Britain, so the reason that they could be released as early as October 1941 is they had signalled their intention to join the pioneers in Britain, which they did. In Britain they joined the Pioneer Corps. Do you know if they ever considered staying in Australia or determined to get home?
Certainly my father, all he wanted to do was get home. And remember, for him, unlike for some of the others, England was his home. Yeah. He'd been in England since 1933. He'd actually been in London before then, because when his father was posted to London, so he had much of his formative years in London. He was engaged to an English girl. There was no question he wanted to get home. Ailey was already married, certainly was also engaged. Incidentally, both these Jewish boys both marrying English Christian girls. Fascinating parallel there as well.
So can you tell us about your father's experiences through the rest of the war? So he was back in, must have been late 1941, he was home?
Yeah, so the Pioneer Corps, the whole point of the Pioneer Corps was although they were paid the same as any other soldiers, they rarely carried firearms, at least at the beginning, so that the army could make sure. And as you probably know, they were known as the King's most loyal enemy aliens. And then towards the end of the war, it was quite clear that they were loyal. And so they were issued with firearms. And although they were told early on it was unlikely that pioneers could become commissioned officers, my father was commissioned, became a lieutenant, then a major, and was sent out to Malaya. Of course, it's possible that internment saved his life, because had he joined the army in 1939, he might have been sent straight out to the war, and he would have had 2 or 3 years more of combat, 2 or 3 years more possibilities of being killed or injured. As it was, he survived the war uninjured. The irony, I'm not telling you anything about the Dunera itself, because I assume everybody knows about the appalling conditions on the Dunera and how the passengers out there were beaten, how their luggage was pilfered, how it really was described as Britain's concentration camp. But the irony was that he ended the war in charge of a shipload of Japanese prisoners of war. You couldn't make it up. I mean, another thing you couldn't make up, I had on my desk until a couple of years ago a picture of my grandfather in German army uniform going off to fight the British, and my father in British uniform going off to fight the Germans, the Italians and the Japanese. Such is life.
I don't think anyone from the family here today, but the Stocky family, a well-known Melbourne Dunera family, their father, Jules, who was on the Dunera and eventually served in the Australian Army in the 8th Employment Company, his two brothers fought for Germany in the same war. And just, I mean, what a horrible sort of, how did the world come to that, really? Yeah. Can you tell us about your father's post-war life?
He had a Bachelor of Commerce, I think it was called, from LSE. He was a student when he was arrested. They'd been, at the time of his arrest, all the students had been evacuated from London to Cambridge, which is where I think he must have been arrested. I'm not quite sure where he was arrested, actually. Then after the war, he became a personnel manager, which is now called an HR, Human Resources Manager, for Philips, the Dutch electronics company. And he worked for Mullards, which was a division, a British division that made television tubes. In the days when television had cathode ray tubes. So we were the first family in our street to have a television. And on occasion, the whole street would come into our house to watch the television. The screen was about half the size of this. But that was never really his passion. He became a councillor, a local councillor. We were, for the Liberal Party, with a capital L in this case, very much following his father's liberal political instincts. He became a local councillor. He worked for the Marriage Guidance Council, and eventually he and my mother jointly became senior tutors for the Marriage Guidance Council in the UK, and became two of the most senior figures. And eventually he gave up. He retired from Mullard and did that full time. And never ever once, as I say, spoke to us about his wartime experience, let alone Dunera.
When I did my PhD in Edinburgh, and I remember watching you on TV, and it's a ubiquitous presence on British TV for a long time. And there's
he's showing his age now.
As a rising BBC journalist, you encountered Eric, or later anglicised to Eric Stadlen, a Dunera boy. And Stadlen's older brother, some of you may know, was Peter Stadlen, who was a world-famous concert pianist, who was also on the Dunera. Can you tell us about your encounters with Eric?
I had no idea that I vaguely perhaps might have known at that stage my father was on a boat called Dunera. I'm not sure I did. I certainly had no idea that Eric Stadlen had. But I was a freelance. I was incredibly lucky to get a job I never got a job with the BBC, ever. I was always freelance. But somebody had, in a news trainee session, had dropped out, and I was told, look, there's a space, do you want to do something? And I said, well, okay, fine, I'll go along. And Eric Stadlen said, he was a man with a clear German accent, rather like my father's. That's the only thing I knew about him. He was a very kindly man, I thought. And he told us all to find a news story, write it ourselves, and bring it in. So I did, and it must be no more than 60 seconds. We were going to present it to camera. So I did, and we had to time it, 60 seconds, and did all that. So he said, okay, now it's your turn. So I stood up, and instead of the camera, there was Eric Stadlen. And I started reading to him. And he said, oh, that's really good. That's really good. I said, oh, thank you. He said, can I see the script? I said, I handed him the script. He tore it in half. He put it upside down on the desk and said, now tell me. I said, I can't, you've got the script. He said, you told me it was true. It is true. You told me you wrote it. I did. Well, now tell me the story. So I started stumbling through. And Eric said, much better. Now you're talking to me. Before, you were reading at me. That's all he said. And that was the best 3 minutes I have ever had of tutorial in my life. Eric, I love you wherever you are now. And now I discover he was on the Dunera. Amazing.
So again, that was something you found out much later.
Much later, yeah.
So a few years ago, at the time of Brexit, you announced publicly that you were taking German citizenship. I seem to... was it an article in the Times that you wrote?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that? And there's also a wonderful story you tell of an interaction of sorts with Angela Merkel.
My father had a sort of bittersweet, as you would expect, relationship with Germany. As children, we were never taught German. Nobody spoke German. He despised Germany. He would never go back to Germany. Only very much later in his life, he must have been well into his 60s, old schoolmates had found him and begged him to come back for a school reunion. He absolutely wouldn't. My mother eventually persuaded him. And I think very reluctantly, they went back to Berlin. He met some school chums, and they got on famously. And then they went back again. I went back after his death to look at where he had been brought up, a road called Klopstockstrasse in Berlin, which no longer exists. The British had seen to that. It no longer exists in any form whatsoever. But I did go to this town called Eberswalde, which was where his family had come from. And later on, Sarah came with me, with 2 of our boys. And I said, I think that's the house where my grandfather was born. We were looking through the window, and this German guy came up, sort of staring at us, and demanded in German, what are you doing? And Sarah, I didn't know she'd done German at school, somehow stumbled out, the father of my husband was born here. And the man said, wait. And we weren't sure if he was going to get the police or what he was going to do. And about 5 minutes later, a man pedalled up on a bicycle and wanted to know why we were here. And we said exactly that. And a bit difficult through translation, but he spoke decent English. And he said, and your name is? And I said, Nicholas. And he said, Nicholas Ross. Yeah. So your sister is Judith. What is this man talking about? And what we discovered is that virtually every town in Germany, the immediate generation, I don't think exists anymore, was so ashamed, so perplexed, so bewildered about what their parents' generation had done, that there were people like him who were the town historians. The street names had all been renamed after Jews who had been arrested and taken away. He knew everything about our family, traced of the family. He knew distant members of the family who had gone to concentration camps, but I knew nothing about. He went and took us to the First World War Memorial in the little village, where he showed the absence of my great-uncle, who died in the First World War, because the Nazis had taken down his name because he was Jewish. And took us. And then when we went back, we were taken out to lunch by the mayor of Eberswalde, which is a decent-sized town. It was just extraordinary. And I felt Germany... I'd also been to Japan, and Japan had absolutely denied it had ever done anything wrong in the war. You go to Hiroshima, it's as though, out of the blue, the Allies had decided to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. But my experience of Germany had been so different. And I decided I would take out German citizenship. This is long before Brexit, incidentally. And then the final straw for this was going to the German embassy in London to pick up my documentation. And there was a woman there, Angela, what's her name? Not Merkel, but Angela, some guy anyway. As she handed me her passport, she said, "It is my great privilege on behalf of the people of Germany to give you back the passport which should never have been taken away from you. And it's hugely emotional. And that's why I did it. Anyway, I wrote a piece for the Times, but before that, I wrote a piece to Angela Merkel. The pretentious thing of writing to the Chancellor. But I said in the letter, look, you'll never ever see this letter, but I hope that one of your staff would at least tell you that one person wants to thank you in your country, and this is why I've done it. And then I get a call from her office, from her spokesman, saying, well, actually, she has seen your letter, and she's asked me to give you a call and thank you for it. And I said, well, why is she? He said, look, I've got to confess, I'll tell you what he said in English, it was a crap news day. Everything was going wrong. It was the only nice thing we had to offer that day. So Angela Merkel did actually apparently get the letter. So there you go.
Just purely out of interest, in a time when people seem to get outraged so easily, was there any negative comment about you taking German citizenship?
Yeah, and completely understandable. There was. There were people who said this is a country that murdered half my family. Well, what the hell do you think you're doing? And my reasoning was, this isn't the country that murdered half your family. This is so different, so different. Now, of course, just recently, in the last couple of months, Germany has decided to rearm, as, of course, as Japan, but through very, very different reasons. It is still and we've seen about the rise of the far right in Germany. Yeah, but we've seen the rise of the far right in France. Look at Brexit in Britain, which was caused by nationalism. We've seen a certain amount of, we've got a new party in Britain, which is, to many minds, unpleasantly right-wing. So I don't go along with those who said it's deep in the country's culture, that's what I'm not saying culture's got nothing to do with it. If you look at Russia and how that goes back through from the what they call the Beaux-Arts to the Commissars, to the Tsars to the Commissars, it's a nation which has never known democracy. It's always known kleptocracy and autocracy. But Germany had a whole series of different things. And also remember, there's East Germany and West Germany. The Romans had occupied only part of Germany. And it had always been a divided country, and Hitler always got the most of his support from the part which incidentally supported the communists and is still the most nationalistic. So I understood why people objected, but I thought that you certainly can't blame the grandchildren and the children for what their predecessor has done, any more than you can blame me for slavery and for the British Empire. Or praise me for it if you want, depending on your politics.
It's, I can well imagine that the comment when you got your passport back. What a powerful sense of occasion. And I feel emotional thinking about that. It must have been quite something for you.
There's another little incident. I've never really used my passport, except once when we were going into Germany. And my wife was waiting, and I thought the queue was ludicrous. I'll go through and get the baggage and see the other side. Went through, no queue, of course, and there was a woman at the passport desk who took my passport, spoke to me in German. I said, I'm sorry, I don't speak any German. To which she said, well, welcome home nevertheless. And I'm just trying to think of a British border guard, of somebody else coming and saying, I do not speak English, saying, well, welcome Britain nevertheless.
Sorry to indulge, somewhat of a self-indulgent moment, but when I came home to visit my parents when I was studying in Edinburgh and then returned to Britain, and I was always given quite a hard time when I got to the British border, and the British border officer said, what are you doing here? And I said, I study in Edinburgh, just going back. What do you study? I'm doing a PhD. What are you doing a PhD in? British history. What aspect of British history? I said, Den Era. He said, well, I want you to tell me about that. And so I started, and I sort of got about 3 sentences in. He's like, oh my God, and stamped stamped the passport and said, on you go. So final question before we go to audience questions. And I think probably you've touched on this already, but it'd still be nice to finish on it, I think. What's most significant to you about the De Niro story and your father's experiences, especially now that you know more of them?
Well, first, I mentioned I won't go into it again. I think I've never really understood the humiliation part of survivors. You think surely what they've been through is terrible, and it's the physical privations that we all know about, and the appalling things they saw, but just the humiliation is really, I think this has really brought home to me the humiliation of what it is to be a prisoner. I think the other thing, and it enraged me but doesn't surprise me, is the cover-up. My father lost very little. As he says in the letters home, I had very little to start with, so there's very little for the crew to steal from me. But others lost everything, including documentation, passports, and the ability to go on and through life, and their baggage ransacked and stolen. But many of them were injured, seriously assaulted, which my father never was. Even so, when I found one of the books about the De Niro, and I didn't know he had, and he'd written notes in the margin, and the bit that he'd put a real black line on was about the court-martial for three of the soldiers. He says in the letters home that the naval personnel behaved impeccably. It was the soldiers, only the soldiers. And there was a Lieutenant O'Neill, there was a Lieutenant Colonel Scott, I think, but they just let the crew, or encouraged the other soldiers, sorry, not the crew, the other soldiers behaved very badly. And he's put these marks along the side of the book about the court-martial, where Scott, who's obviously doesn't give a damn and has lied through his teeth and is never questioned properly, and nor are any of the victims of the Niro brought to the court-martial. What happened is the most junior person was convicted and stripped of the ranks and discharged from the army. Not the officers, including the one that everybody hated most of all, this chap called O'Neill, who was a violent thug. It taught me a number of things. Firstly, never allow the army to mark its own homework. Any army. And incidentally, if you read the papers today, you'll see two more episodes of this, one from Britain, one from Israel. In Israel, the army absolutely denied killing some 15 aid workers in cold blood, and now all of a sudden some video has emerged. So the Israeli Defense Forces said they emerged, there was no signing on their vehicles, they came with no lights, we couldn't see where they were pretty clear, we killed terrorists, and now the video emerges and it was all lies, total lies. The people who were killed were videoing it themselves until the point they're killed. And you can see the red lights, the ambulances are all marked with red crosses or red crescents. It's absolute lies. Now the Israeli government today has admitted this, but the soldiers lied, and they would have got away with it had it not been for that video. I was cut my teeth as a journalist in Northern Ireland. I once interviewed a woman who had saved a soldier's life, incredibly bravely. She was a Catholic woman living on the top of a place called Divis Flats, the heart of IRA territory, and a soldier had been injured. She dragged him into his flat, barricaded the door against the IRA, so you'll have to shoot me first, until the army got up to save him. I sent her a Christmas card later that year, and she wrote back, said she'd never do it again. Oh my God, what's happened? The IRA have gone to attack her. No, what happened was her nephew had been picked up by the British, had been beaten to a pulp, and nobody would believe him. And so I did some inquiries, went to the hospital, talked to the doctor who treated him, who said that definitely he had been beaten up quite badly, if not systematically. Turned out the doctor was a Protestant, thank heavens, which in Northern Ireland is a big thing, incidentally, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, whether you're an IRA supporter or not. The BBC wouldn't run it without the army giving us an interview. The army wouldn't give an interview. It turned out this was happening all the time. And eventually my producer very bravely said I was allowed to tell the army we were going to put it out whether or not they put up a spokesman. So they put up a spokesman, and the spokesman, still got the interview somewhere, in a very, very posh English accent. He said, well, unfortunately, after this chap had been interrogated, well, I should say interviewed, really, we thanked him very much and sent him on his way. But unfortunately, there was a big gale blowing that night, and as he went out of the barracks, I'm afraid the wind caught the gates and he got a terrible clouting, and I'm afraid that's really what happened. We put this out. I tell you, half the people of the audience thought, how dare you? Our troops are engaged in combat here. How dare you put this thing which is undermining our soldiers? How dare you put this out? And many of them believed that the soldier had given a perfectly good explanation. One of my colleagues said, did you not check the weather forecast? What was the weather that night? Gales blowing. I said, oh, such a stupid young journalist, never occurred to me. So I checked. They'd had to launch lifeboats on Belfast Loch Ness to rescue 2 sailing boats that had become becalmed. I learned never to believe people who've got every opportunity of doing something violent and getting away with it. And troops are trained to be violent. It attracts. And the other story you'll see again today, about British soldiers, about their maltreatment of civilians in Kenya. It happened years ago during the Mau Mau insurgency, where the Mau Mau behaved disgracefully, and I'm sorry to say British soldiers behaved disgracefully back. But now we've got a case much more recently of a woman who was raped and killed by a British soldier, and other British soldiers have just kept it stum. So that's another thing I learned, that when I read about the court-martial and saw my father's outrage at the failure of anybody really to be brought to justice. But can I just say one more thing before we open the question? My father always said, and it's in these notes, this was an aberration. Dunera was an aberration. The British are decent people. He never ever blamed the country for what the country had done to him, which I thought was really rather extraordinary. I'd like to think he was right, but my experience in Northern Ireland told me he was at best only half right.
Before we move to questions, please join me in, Nick has shared so much today and so Would anyone like to ask a question, and if so, please wait for the microphone to reach you. Leon.
Nick, many thanks. That was brilliant.
Microphone's not on.
Okay.
The microphone's for the video, not for the audio in the room, so it's working.
It's working, thank you. Nick, to repeat, that was brilliant. Thank you so very much. I can add to your story about contacting Angela Merkel and receiving a notification from one of her press secretaries. His name was Stefan Siebert.
Same person.
And he is now the ambassador from Germany to Israel. And I met him 2 years ago in Jerusalem when he presided at a Yad Vashem ceremony, which was to honour the courageous Germans who protected my uncle and aunt in Berlin and in Gross Schönbeck during the Holocaust. So the linkage that you get, and it relates to the notion of German guilt, etc. And I remember Stefan's words at the ceremony. He said, we in this generation do not bear the guilt of what happened during the Holocaust, but we most certainly must ensure that we will never forget and never again will we stand by and allow such a thing to happen. And I thought this was extremely, how shall I put it, the message of this generation. And we've bonded remarkably well with the descendants of the German families who hid my family during the Holocaust.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Rolene?
Thanks, Dennis.
Oh, just wait for the microphone.
Sorry,
Rolene. Thank you.
wait for the microphone. Thank you. Rolene Lamb. Nick, that was absolutely wonderful. I was completely fascinated from beginning to end. What I'm going to say is not exactly a question, but it begs a question. I'm quite in awe of the fact that you have so much material, like original material, that has been saved from Australia back to England through all the years, and you have these original documents and pictures that were all saved. How do such things get saved?
Obviously, De Niro was hugely important in his life. He didn't keep much about anything else, and yet all this was a trove that he kept with him wherever he moved. It's the one thing that we found. No, that's not true. There were lots of love letters to my mum. My sister, after my mother died, my sister and my brother and I sat around and thought, what are we going to do with all these? And we decided they were too intimate, we couldn't read them. And to my horror, well, we threw them away with my sisters and assistants. And when we started meeting people like Seamus, who are historians, saying, you did what? But yeah, it obviously, this year and a half, 2 years of his life was such an impactful part of his life.
Thanks.
Paul?
Not a question, statement, a little bit of both. Just your story resonates so much, I think, with everybody here, with the relationship to Germany and all those things. And I just think the more you hear other people's stories, the more it just aligns with what my grandfather or my father and whatever went through in those families. And funnily enough, listening to you about going back to Germany, my father, who came here as a 10-year-old, he didn't go back to Berlin until he was in his late 50s, and again fell in love with the place and went back regularly. And also similar, I had the same experience going to Germany last year with my German passport that I'm proud of, and having the same experience of them speaking in German. But funnily enough, a very quick story more so, when my father first went back there with an Australian passport, and again the passport person said, oh, first time in Germany, he said, since the war, and the person apologised. So you talk about that acknowledgement, and yeah, I think I sort of are proud of my background, and hence why I have a German passport as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
At the front.
Up the front, Janet, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Adrian. My father, Max Brook, was a De Niro boy. It was interesting because to hear you talk, because a lot of us, and Stephen Lewinsky's there, a lot of the De Niro boys in Melbourne became family to each other. And we all shared an interesting and growing up period, which you missed out on. But I think the thing I wanted to talk about was that my father grew up in a town near Mönchengladbach called Dulken, which was one of the first towns to embrace National Socialism. So he knew the shame of being Jewish before his bar mitzvah. Years later, and 30-something years ago, 35 years ago, the town, that next generation got together to say, our parents have not told us anything, we would like to meet some of these people that were Jewish in our town. And so they invited a whole lot of people to come back, including my father, my uncle and my aunt, who all grew up in the same area. And so they videoed it, 2020, the ABC American did a video documentary of it. I could see my father and my uncle standing on my grandfather's house on the porch, which made me really interesting because growing up Australian with no connections to Germany, it was a very strange thing. We became German citizens as well, so we got dual citizenship, and I wanted to go visit. So I sent an email to the mayor of Mönchengladbach, who very quickly said, no, I'm sorry. your father was not born in Mönchengladbach. It was probably Dulken. So I'm going to introduce you to the person from Dulken, who responded. And they said, come out and visit. Now, this is interesting because this area, the first area to embrace National Socialism, there was a law which said if you don't want to have a Stolperstein, a stumbling block, outside your place, you can say no. This was the only area in Germany where this was not possible. And this group that I met got 10,000, not Jewish, got 10,000 signatures together to say this is wrong. People that lived here had no choice, they were forced out. Why should you who live here say no to some resemblance? Anyway, so we came and I got to see the stand on the railway station where my father said goodbye to his parents and his sister who ended up in Riga and concentration camp and died. But they then took us around and I got to see the mayor came to visit. We took us out to lunch and all very similar. So it really was a strange thing for an Australian Jewish boy who had German heritage with no connections to feel welcome.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an echo of our story. I'm so pleased it didn't just happen to us. I'm so pleased that this is a sort of a general pattern. That's a great story.
Meryl, thank you.
Nick, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a few questions about your father. So, how old was he when he was on the boat?
I think about 24, 25, early 20s anyway.
And also, two other questions. Is one, was he living as a Jew, or did he hide it when he came back, or because?
Oh, is it falling off? Forgive me. Just grab that.
And the same, maybe similar question about his father, because his father was such a well-known figure in Israel. So what was his relationship or your relationship to Israel? Did you know about your grandfather?
Yeah. As everybody here knows, being Jewish is a dual thing. We can be religiously Jewish or just Jewish. And you can't escape one of them, whatever you do. My grandfather, although he was religiously Jewish in a sense, I mean, the fact is when he came to England, one of the first things he did is eat bacon and eggs. He was not really very religious, certainly. If anything, I would say almost opposed to Orthodox Jewry in the sense of opposed to the conservatism, the orthodoxy that went with the political orthodoxy that went with it. So we were never Jewish in a religious sense. And my grandmother was never Jewish in any real sense, except she was Jewish. So we were never really brought up. We weren't to feel Jewish. We certainly weren't brought up to feel Christian. I mean, we knew we were Jewish, or at least we knew that my father was Jewish. But of course, because my mother wasn't, technically I wasn't Jewish. On the other hand, it was great at school, where assembly was very, very boring in the mornings. So rather than listen to all the hymns and the boring stuff from the headmaster, I put my hand up and said, I'm Jewish. So I didn't have to attend. It came in very usefully occasionally. But it was never really much part of our life. We didn't do Friday nights until I got married. And even then it was only with Sarah's parents, because Sarah and I don't do Friday nights. We're not religiously Jewish in any sense. It just so happens, and this is the other bit that you can't get away from, that hugely disproportionate number of our friends are Jewish. I mean, that is something which, I don't know how it happens, but it's in the miasma out there.
So your father didn't hide the fact that he was Jewish?
No, oh no, absolutely. He hid the fact he was German, but he couldn't. And my friends, when I was a schoolboy, said, why's your dad got a funny accent? And I said, what funny accent? Because I'd been brought up with my dad. It never occurred to me he had a funny accent. He certainly never proclaimed he wanted to be German. That is for sure. But he never hid the fact that he was Jewish. My grandfather, he was on quite good terms with my grandmother, even though they divorced. And he remarried rather tragically as it happened, because his second wife then died quite quickly in Jerusalem. But my earliest memories of knowledge of my grandfather, he used to come across every two years, which is very expensive in those days. And every year my Israeli family would send oranges, and everybody in our street was so jealous of post-war oranges. And then once I went to visit with my parents when I was about 10 or 11. This is what I must tell you the story. We arrive at the airport, Tel Aviv. I've never flown before. It's very, very exciting. And then we're called to the front, and we go down the steps, and there's my grandfather at the bottom of the steps. And we hug, and wonderful. We get into his car as a chauffeur. I'm much more interested in the chauffeur than my grandfather. I've never met a chauffeur before. He was called David, and I was talking to David, and then we drove off. Many years later, the next time I went on an aeroplane, I was astonished to find that there wasn't a chauffeur waiting at the bottom of the steps for us. So the relationships were good, cordial. And there's a story that my grandmother, although she was the one that refused to go with him to Palestine, when waving him off each time at Heathrow, there were tears in her eyes about the fact that we're going. So they remained on decent terms.
And did you come back to Israel?
Oh yes. No, I've been to it. You say come back? Yes. I've been to Israel several times, but one of our sons has never been. So now I suspect everybody in this room has got challenging views about Israel. The Israel, when I first went there, was run by the Labour Party. Whatever your politics, you didn't have to be left or right. But the far right was not really a major part. It was always sort of there. This aggressive nationalism, which has sort of swept the world now. It seems to be everywhere. My attitude to Israel is, I think, like many people who are Jewish, or in my case, half Jewish, is ambivalent. I was interviewed on the 80th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence as one of the children of one of the founding fathers, and I was asked then, what would you think about Israel? And I said, well, do you identify with Israel? I said, of course, I fight for Israel. I'm an old man, but I'd fight for Israel. I think if I was asked that question today, I'd find it very hard to find an answer. I'm not sure I could come out straight away and say the same thing.
Any more questions?
Thanks so much, Nick, for such a clear exposition. My uncle, Eric Tischauer, was on the Dunera. He had a leather works in Upper Silesia, and I had a neighbour of mine was in Surrey Hills, eastern suburbs of Melbourne, was a Dunera boy, Manfred Klein, Mike Klein, and I used to take him to meet a former colleague of his, Harry Unger, both of whom were educated in Berlin at the Ort Technical School. And I wondered whether you ever saw or heard anything of that, because they both spoke with great warmth about their studies there, and they got out very late on a train through the Netherlands to England. But have you ever seen anything of the Ort School and its after the memorials to it?
I haven't. And again, I just want to confess, and it is a confession of my ignorance, not just about what my father went through, but I knew much more about my grandfather than my grandmother, but there was a relationship here because she obviously went to a technical school of some sort or other. It turns out, because the Jewish Museum in Berlin contacted us and said they wanted to know about my grandmother. I said, why do you want to know about my grandmother? It turns out she was the first woman to become a silversmith and goldsmith in Germany. And when she came to Britain, because of the closed shop system, she was not allowed to continue as a goldsmith. And so she did what many refugees do. She started doing bed and breakfast or doing anything they could to raise money. And she started a toy company. She was a remarkable artist. We've inherited lots of her pictures. And there's no rubbing out. With a single line, pencil line, she could do just about anything. And she made these cut-out toys and had a company called Fancy Craft. So she'd obviously got a lot of technical training from somewhere. And incidentally, I think the proudest moment of her life was in 1951, when there was something called the Festival of Britain. Britain was trying to pick itself up after the Second World War at this sort of festival, which was on the south bank of the Thames. I remember being taken as a child. All I wanted to do was go to sleep. It was so noisy and lots of bright lights. My grandmother had been chosen to represent British toy making. Here was a German Jewish girl, denied her right to be a silversmith in Britain, but being chosen to represent the country she had adopted. And she was so proud of that.
Leon?
This is a question of both Seamus and Nick. No doubt you'll have a conference afterwards about where that extremely valuable trove of your father's writings and your uncle's cutouts are going to go. Which museum will it go to? Likely to go to.
I would always follow Nick and Sarah's wishes, of course, but if they were to ask me for a recommendation, I would suggest the State Library of New South Wales on the basis that largest collection, and they have, I've spent a lot of time in Jewish Museum over the years, and it's a very fine institution, but they just don't have the money to exhibit it or make it available all the time, and the State Library of New South Wales, as a government institution, does have that funding, so I think it reaches more people going to that institution.
Danny would like to say something.
Thanks so much. Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. You've had a vote of thanks already for my wife, the chairman of the Lamb Library. Mirav's extended a vote of thanks as well. So, third time lucky for both of you. Seamus, notwithstanding everything that you've said, the Lamb Library is happy to make a pitch to keep this material and to exhibit it. And, now's not the time for appeal. So maybe we're short of money, but we're actually not short of money for something that's very close to our hearts, because my father was a Dunera boy. And what I thought was fascinating in your presentation was that there are many of us here who are the children of Dunera people, and I think our stories are all different.
Yeah.
And Mirav's invited me to say something on a future occasion, and so I'll reserve the limited amount of material that I have for that occasion. But your experience was different, and the one thing I just want to refer to is my father never had any feeling of insufficiency or shame in any respect to his experience of going through the Dunera at all. In fact, it was an opportunity for incredible growth for him.
Yeah.
And that came through to me, to my kids too. We all benefit, and there are people here, you can hear from the quality of the comments that have been made, who all gain from that. But Mirav, thanks for organising this. Seamus, thank you for your continued interest in this very important subject. Nick, terrific to have you here and to hear you. You won't be surprised to know that some of us have different political opinions, and I represent the centre-right, and my father was ended up being the chairman of what is the Friends of Likud of the government. So we do have different approaches, and some of it stems from the experience that he and others had. But thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here in the library, and we welcome your further involvement, not just to hear me on another occasion, but there are so many interesting things that Mirav is running, and the library is here for the community, so we'd like you to embrace it and take advantage of it because it's all available for you. Nick, thanks so much. And Sarah, which one's Sarah? Hi. Why are you hiding in the back?
I'm not.
You definitely were. You're hiding in the back. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being involved. This was really wonderful. It was great to hear you speak.
Danny, can I say one thing?
Bavakasha.
I just wanted to say about Holocaust survivors here, and maybe the same goes for the Nira boys. There's something really different. For growing up in Israel, Holocaust survivors did not get the respect, and they did not flourish the way they did in Australia. Mm-hmm. So there's something different in the community here, and I don't know how to explain it. And what you said about your father and about Holocaust survivors that came after the war, like there was so much pride. And I wish your father could have felt the same thing in England, and a lot of people in Israel who did it, so who didn't. And I think there's something, I mean, I'm not originally from here, I'm now part of the community, but I think there's something really, really unique and different about the Jewish community in Melbourne.
It's very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting. Early on in the piece, there was a visitor from what was known then as the Jewish Welfare Society. And this representative came to check on the incarcerated people. But he did say, we don't want you refos to stay here. When it's over, clear out. I remember the details. My father was disgusted and so on. But the numbers of Jewish refugees who came here, post-war survivors, effectively doubled the population, the Jewish population. I mean, just round figures. And they had an enormous impact. And I think the explanation, Mirav, is Israel was struggling with its development, And you Israelis somehow had a view that you were condescending to Jews who allowed themselves to end up in that situation because you'd already fought for your independence or you had already been involved in the resistance for a long time. Here in Australia, it was a different ballgame. But our Australian Jewish community is a very strong community, a very confident and assertive community, a proud one, feel 100% committed to the Commonwealth of Australia, real dinky die Aussies, and it doesn't matter what our religious persuasion is. And I think that's the way the majority of the Australians feel.
I was just looking for one of the points that I've just read about this and only discovered this last night, just looking through these again, where again and again he talks about the warmth of the Australians. The documentation shows otherwise, exactly as you said. There were anti-Semites in government who said, we don't want these awful people here in Australia. But everything my father writes about meeting actual Australians is about warmth and welcoming.
Listen, I'll just give you one story to go away with. On that train ride on the Friday night, Seamus will know this because he was involved in interviews with my dad and so on. they're on the train. They've been met by, half the Australian army, And one of the soldiers taps my dad on the shoulder and says, Shabbat Shalom. He wasn't a Jewish soldier. He was an Australian soldier who had served in Palestine and had the warmest memories of the Jewish community. And my father, who was, very, very fast, he said, I've got a sister living in Charnwood Crescent in St Kilda. Will you tell her that I'm here? Just like that, and gave an address. 4 weeks later, this Australian soldier on a break makes the trek, and they were in Whoop Whoop, you know what Whoop Whoop is? Whoop Whoop is hay. Okay, so they were up there, and he goes down to Melbourne, he knocks on the door, and he says, I can't tell you any more information other than that your brother is in Australia and he's safe. Now that's Australia.
Yeah.
That's an Australian person.
Great.
And that's the way Australian behaviour is.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.